Hello everyone, I am Neelam Vaishno. Today in this video, we will look at the landmark cases on fundamental rights which have helped evolve these rights. The structure of this presentation will be as follows. First, we provide a brief introduction of the fundamental rights, followed by the significance of these fundamental rights. Then we look at the key landmark cases on each of the fundamental rights. Then we understand the trends on these landmark cases. Finally, we note down the key takeaways and conclude this presentation. So let's get started with the presentation material. Starting with a brief introduction of the fundamental rights. Fundamental rights are enshrined in Part 3 of the Indian Constitution, Article 12 to 35. The six fundamental rights consist of right to equality, right to freedom, right against exploitation, right to freedom of religion, cultural and educational right, and right to constitutional remedies. These rights guarantee civil liberties and provide the framework for an individual's freedom and equality. All the historical landmark cases have shaped the way these rights are understood and enforced in India. Now, let's understand the importance and significance of fundamental rights, or simply why fundamental rights matter. The fundamental rights provide protection against arbitrary state action. They ensure individual freedoms, dignity, and equality. These rights guarantee essential freedoms such as freedom of speech, religion, and movement, while upholding a person's dignity and promoting equality before the law. The fundamental rights protect the rights of minorities and marginalized groups. And these fundamental rights act as a check on the power of the government, where they act as an important counterbalance to the potential axis of government power, limiting arbitrary rule and ensuring that democratic principles and the rule of law are upheld in the governance system. In the following few slides, we will cover the key historical landmark cases on each fundamental rights. So let's look at the Indira Sawhney versus Union of India case of 1992, also known as Mandal Commission case, relate to right to equality. In this case, the issue was whether the reservation system recommended by the Mandal Commission for OBCs in government jobs and educational institutions was constitutional, or if it violated the right to equality guaranteed under Article 14. The Mandal Commission recommended a 27% reservation for OBCs, and the government decided to implement it. The challenge in the case focused on whether such reservations would lead to discrimination and create inequality. The judgment of the Supreme Court upheld the reservation system but placed a 50% cap on reservations to maintain fairness. They also introduced the creamy layer concept to exclude wealthier members of the OBCs, ensuring that only the economically backward benefit from these reservations. This case highlights that affirmative actions is allowed under Article 14 as a means of achieving social justice for historical marginalized groups. However, this must be balanced with the need to ensure equal opportunities for others, and the system should not be misused. Now, let's study about Maneka Gandhi versus Union of India, case of 1978, which relates to right to freedom. In this landmark case, the main issue was whether the right to life and personal liberty under Article 21 can be restricted by the government without following a fair and reasonable procedure. To provide a bit more context, Maneka Gandhi's passport was impounded by the government without any prior hearing or explanation. She challenged this action, arguing that it violated her personal liberty, which is protected under Article 21. In this case, the Supreme Court was asked to decide if such a restriction on personal liberty could be imposed without due process. The government had evoked Article 21, which guarantees the right to life and personal liberty, but did not follow a fair or reasonable procedure before taking the action. Maneka Gandhi's petition argued that Article 21 mandated that any such restriction must be imposed through fair, just, and reasonable procedures. The judgment of the court ruled in favor of Maneka Gandhi, holding that Article 21 must be interpreted to include procedure fairness. The court made it clear that no restriction on personal liberty can be imposed unless it is in accordance with fair, just, and reasonable procedures. This case is significant because it broadened the interpretation of Article 21 by incorporating procedural fairness. It emphasized that a person's liberty cannot be restricted in an arbitrary or unjust manner, and every individual is entitled to a fair hearing and reasonable procedure under the law. The case also connected Article 21, right to life and personal liberty, with Article 14, right to equality, as it stressed that restrictions on liberty must not be arbitrary or discriminatory, ensuring that everyone is treated equally under the law. The Maneka Gandhi case was a turning point in constitutional law because it highlighted that fundamental rights like personal liberty must be interpreted in a broader, progressive manner. It laid the foundation for future cases where procedural fairness and due process become integral to the enforcement of the fundamental rights in India. Moving on to study a landmark case on right against exploitation. People's Union for Democratic Rights versus Union of India, case of 1982. The issue was whether forced labor and bonded labor violate Article 23, which prohibits exploitation. To provide more context, workers were being compelled to work under inhuman conditions, and the case questioned if this amounted to forced labor. To summarize, the People's Union for Democratic Rights challenged forced and bonded labor, arguing it violated Article 23, right against exploitation. Workers were being forced to work under threat, violating their right to freedom and dignity. The Supreme Court ruled that forced labor and bonded labor violate Article 23 and directed the government to end these practices and provide rehabilitation. The court therefore expanded the scope of Article 23 to include bonded labor, ensuring all forms of exploitation are unconstitutional. These cases highlighted the need for stronger enforcement against exploitation and better protection for workers. Related to the fundamental right to freedom of religion, the Indian Young Lawyers Association versus State of Kerala, case of 2018, also known as Sabrimala case. The key issue was whether the ban on menstruating women entering the Sabrimala temple violated Article 25, the right to freedom of religion. This case challenged the gender-based ban that restricted women of menstruating age from entering the temple, arguing that it discriminated against women's religious rights. The Supreme Court judgment ruled that the ban was unconstitutional, stating that gender discrimination violated Article 25, which guarantees freedom of religion and equal access to place of worship for all. This case expanded Article 25 to include non-discrimination, ensuring that women have equal access to religious practices and places of worship, regardless of their gender. Now, cultural and educational rights were reviewed by the case of St. Stephen's College versus University of Delhi, case of 1992. The key issue in this case was whether Delhi University's reservation policy for admission should apply to minority educational institutions like St. Stephen's College under Article 30. The case arose when St. Stephen's College, a minority institution, was challenged for not fully following the reservations policy set by Delhi University, which mandates a certain number of seats for backward classes. The question was whether such institutions could maintain their autonomy and admissions or whether they must adhere to state-imposed reservations rules. The Supreme Court ruled that minority institutions have the right to admit students of their choice under Article 30. But they must comply with reasonable state regulations, including reservation for socially backward classes. In other words, while minority institutions can set their own admission policies, they cannot ignore laws related to affirmative actions aimed at social justice. This judgment balanced the institutional autonomy of minority schools under Article 30 with the need for social justice through affirmative action policies. It reinforced that minority institutions can maintain freedom in admissions but must also play a role in promoting equal opportunities for underprivileged groups through reservation. The important fundamental right to constitutional remedies, has historically evolved with the help of several cases, with a significant one being the Kesavananda Bharati versus State of Kerala, the case of 1973. The key issue was whether Parliament has the power to amend the basic structure of the Constitution, including fundamental rights like Article 32, which guarantees the right to constitutional remedies. Kesavananda Bharati challenged a constitutional amendment that limited the scope of fundamental rights. The case questioned how far Parliament amending power could go without altering the basic structure of the Constitution. The judgment of the Supreme Court ruled that Parliament cannot amend the basic structure of the Constitution. This includes protecting the right to constitutional remedies under Article 32, which ensures the protection of fundamental rights. The judgment established the basic structure doctrine, which ensures that fundamental rights and key provisions like Article 32 cannot be altered, safeguarding the core values of the Constitution. Having covered a landmark historical cases on each fundamental right in the previous section, let us understand the trends in landmark cases. Expansion of rights. Over time, the scope of fundamental rights in India has expanded. Initially, the focus was on political and civil rights, but today it also covers social, economic and cultural rights. For example, in case like right to education, Article 21A, and right to food, the court has interpreted basic rights as not just political freedoms but also as rights that address societal needs. Role of judiciary. The judiciary plays a critical role in interpreting and protecting fundamental rights. The courts have become the guardian of these rights, ensuring they are upheld even when the executive or legislature acts against them. Courts have adapted fundamental rights to contemporary issues such as gender rights, privacy concerns, and environmental protection, reflecting the evolving nature of society. For instance, in the Puttaswamy case 2017, the court recognized the right to privacy as part of Article 21, adapting the Constitution to address modern day concerns. Now let us summarize the key takeaways of this presentation. The landmark cases have continuously shaped the evolution of fundamental rights in India, and the basic structure doctrine has safeguarded fundamental rights from any arbitrary amendments. The right to life has been broadened to encompass various rights like privacy, dignity, and personal freedom. Indian courts have emphasized the balance between state power and individual liberty in numerous landmark judgments. From the learning in this presentation on landmark cases on fundamental rights, we have the following conclusion. The fundamental rights are essential for the protection of individual freedoms and democratic principles in India. The Supreme Court has played a crucial role in expanding and safeguarding these rights through landmark cases. The continuous evolution of these rights ensures that the Constitution remains dynamic and relevant in addressing modern challenges. Thank you, everyone.